Okay, while people are still joining in, I'll just start with a few announcements and then we'll continue with our session. So usually, as always, people are all joining last minute, so more and more people will drop in. And welcome to June edition of Power Platform User Group Stuttgart. So as always, we have prepared for June as well a lot of interesting content. And if you still didn't, you can reach out to us on Meetup, on LinkedIn, or on Twitter. And you can always watch the previous session recordings on our Power Platform User Group Stuttgart YouTube channel. So most of the recordings are there. Last few ones are still not, so they will be in upcoming days. Today, I'm with you. I'm Augustin, and Christian will be joining you next week again. And as always, we are trying to connect you with best speakers out there and try to do it weekly. And we want to thank each and every of you. So we reached out to more than 1,000 members on our meetup, and number is continuing to grow. So hopefully people have recognized the quality of content and the quality of speakers joining us each and every week. And regarding the other things, so join us. It will not be June 14th this month, but it will be June 15th. We have to move it for one day, Data Jazz on Tuesday. So myself and Nicola are hosting a lot of interesting people from Power BI and Power Platform world in a bit of different format. So if you watched previous episodes, if you didn't, you can still watch it on our YouTube channel. We had Will Thompson, Chris Webb, Phil Seamark, and Jay from Microsoft. Next week, Pragati is joining us. So more from a community perspective, it will be an interesting discussion with her. So join us next week on June 15th. And regarding the Power Platform User Group, so next week with us is Andy Cutler. Sorry for some noise in the back end. Then we have on June 15th, Eric Svensson, and June 22nd, Alex Wittels from Microsoft. Lots of interesting sessions about Synapse, composite models, hybrid models, advanced models. So lots of things coming in. And for today, it's really a pleasure to have Dustin Ryan with us. And I think topic which is really close to my heart and daily area of work is Power BI governance. And whatever session I heard, I always learned something new. So feeling excited about this session. Dustin, welcome, and thanks for joining us on Power Platform User Group.
Yeah, thank you, Augustin. It's a real pleasure to be here with your user group, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to present and hang out with you guys for a little bit.
Yeah. So whenever you are ready, you can start sharing. I'll stop sharing my screen. You can take it over.
Okay. All right, great. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Can everybody see that okay?
It's visible.
Okay, great. Yeah, again, I just really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you guys and hang out and have a great discussion around Power BI. Anytime I get the opportunity to do these kinds of events, I'm very excited to. So I appreciate it, Augustin. Thanks for allowing me the honor and the pleasure. Like Augustin said, this is Power BI Governance 101, and we're going to dive into some topics here around governing Power BI and some of the things to think about. Obviously, data governance is an extremely large topic, and there's we just don't have enough time to dive into all the nitty-gritty details of what goes into planning a data governance strategy and how do you implement data governance. But really, my goal for this session is to give you a high-level understanding of what data governance is and how it's applied to Power BI. And just to give you a little more background on myself here. My name is Dustin Ryan. I'm a data and AI specialist at Microsoft. So I've been at Microsoft for almost 7 years, and I started my position at Microsoft as a cloud solution architect. So I worked as a CSA for 5 years, and in the last couple of years, I've been a data and AI specialist, and I work on the Microsoft education team. And so that means that I work with higher education, K-12, primary school, and Department of Education customers in the United States. And so I've worked with some institutions across the US and implementing Power BI, and as well as the rest of the Azure data platform. I started my career as a BI consultant and trainer, and so I did training and consulting on the traditional SQL Server BI stack, way back in the day. So doing things like building data warehouses and ETL, writing SSIS packages, and building OLAP cubes and writing MDX. But it's been a long time since I've done any of that stuff, and now it's all in the cloud, all the time at Microsoft. Also author, blogger, and speaker at really cool events like this. And I live just outside of Jacksonville, Florida, with my wife and my 3 kids. And so there's a picture of my crew. We're all Star Wars fans, and so I'm pulling off Han Solo, and my wife is Princess Leia, and then Andrew is Yoda, and Dallas is Rey, and Bradley is Luke Skywalker, wearing the Rebel Alliance flight outfit there. So great to meet everybody here. Like I said, my goal here is to introduce you how to pursue data governance methods and how those data governance methods are applied to Power BI. And so what I've got lined up here on the agenda is, what is data governance? Why is data governance needed, and why it's important? How is Power BI deployed? Because that will also inform us to the types of and kinds of data governance processes we might need to think about. And then within the context of Power BI, what do we govern and how do we govern it? Now, as we go through this content here, I hope that this will be an interactive session. So, I hope that you'll ask questions. We've got not too large of a group here, so if there's questions, I certainly don't mind if you hop off mute and just ask me your question, or if you're more comfortable to just type it in the chat room, in the Teams chat. I'm certainly okay for that. If I don't see your question, it's probably because I'm looking at the notes on my slide, or I'm looking at the slide. So just give me a few minutes for that. And Augustine, if you do me the honor, if you see questions come up in the chat and I miss it, just let me know, and I'll make sure I address those things. I want to make sure that any questions get answered. So I hope this will be an interactive discussion. So don't be too shy to ask questions. I certainly don't mind taking questions during the discussion. All right. Okay, so what is data governance? When we think about data governance really includes the people, the processes, and technologies that are needed to manage and protect the company's data assets, in order to guarantee generally that data assets are understandable, that they're correct, that they're complete, trustworthy, secure, and discoverable, meaning that the folks in our organization, our company, can find the data that they need in order to make important decisions. And the whole goal of data governance, right, is that at its core, it's really about establishing methods and an organization with clear responsibilities and processes that allow us to standardize, integrate, protect, and store our data. So nobody does a data governance project because they're bored. And we'll talk about why most data governance projects get started in the first place. But when we think about, well, how do we establish methods and with responsibilities and processes around standardization and integration, protection, and storage of the data, that becomes quite a large project. Okay, I see Harry said the slides are not being made full screen, so they are not readable. Can everybody see my slides okay?
Good to me.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, are you able to read it? Is it large enough?
Fine.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure, Harry, what the issue is. Not sure why it's not showing up full screen, but I think everybody else is able to see it okay. With that being said, too, I'm going to share the slides afterwards with Augustine, so that way we can make sure we get the content distributed to the group too. Okay. Yep. So if you're having trouble seeing it, the slides they're showing up tiny at the bottom. Maybe try clicking on the slides and viewing that full screen instead of looking at my ugly face taking up the full screen. Anyway, let's keep going. So the key goals for data governance are to minimize risks around how we use data. Also establish internal rules for data use, right? There need to be rules around how we use data and who can use data and those kinds of things. We also need to make sure that you can secure your data. Obviously, security of data is an extremely important part of data governance. We need to be able to implement compliance requirements. Another key goal is to improve internal and external communication, and then also increase the value of data. And you can't forget about reducing cost, right? Leaders of successful data governance programs declared back in December 2006 at the Data Governance Conference in Orlando that data governance is between 80 and 95%. So I put this quote from that conference in there because I really think it speaks to the challenges of data governance. When you think about why data governance projects are difficult, or why sometimes they don't go as well as we hope, or they altogether fail, it's really about 80 to 95% communication. Certainly, the technology is a part to that, to any data governance project, but it really boils down to the people and the processes and how we communicate around those things. And so, with all of that stated, it's a given that many of the objectives of a data governance program have to be accomplished with the appropriate tools. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here today. So now that we kind of have a high level understanding and a level set around what is data governance, why is data governance needed? And most companies or organizations already have some form of data governance for individual applications or business departments, although it may not necessarily be comprehensively institutionalized or something like that. The systematic introduction of data governance is therefore really an evolution from informal rules to formal control. What we're talking about here, right, is this journey from tribal knowledge to standardized institutional knowledge that everybody can access. And oftentimes we see formal data governance processes established or implemented once a company or organization has reached a size at which cross-functional tasks can no longer be implemented efficiently. And oftentimes when I have customers that reach out to me and they say, hey, we need to talk about data governance, we need some tools. Usually they don't say, hey, we're looking for data governance. Usually the conversation starts with, well, I need to be able to find all of my sensitive data, because now I have data that's being shared across groups, and I have groups of team members doing different kinds of work. And now I don't understand, or I don't know where is my sensitive data, or I don't know where is duplicated data, or I don't know who has access to this data. And what it really what has resulted is that there is a lack of data governance across those cross-functional areas. Data governance is a prereq for numerous tasks or projects, and it has many clear benefits, and that's what we're talking about here, right? Why is data governance needed, right? First of all, we need to be able to deliver consistent and uniform data and processes across an organization. Obviously, that's a prereq for better and more comprehensive decision support. And so you may have taken part in projects where people aren't sure if they're using the right data to make a decision, or if they're using the best version of the data or the latest version of the data, right? Data governance can help with that. Also, data governance increases the scalability of the IT landscape at a technical, business, and organizational level through clear rules for changing processes and data. And so being able to have standardized rules in place increases the scalability of your organization for how we deliver and manage data. Central control mechanisms offer potential for optimizing cost of data management. And that's increasingly important in the age of exploding data sets, but also in the age of the adoption of public cloud, right? And so cost optimization is a huge benefit for moving to the cloud. And so when we see this explosion of more and larger data sets, but also more adoption of the public cloud, data governance offers some opportunities for cost optimization. I'll also call out increased efficiencies through the use of synergies, being that fourth bullet point down there. So ensuring that we're able to reuse processes and data in a meaningful way, right? We don't want to duplicate processes. We don't want to duplicate data sets. We want to ensure that we can reuse as much as possible to ensure that we're being efficient. Data governance is also needed because we need high confidence in data through quality assured and certified data sets. So how do I know if the data that I'm working with is like the blessed data, is the data that I should be using to make a decision? How many times have you ever been in a conversation with a user or a customer or somebody on your team and you find out that they're using completely wrong data to make decisions, right? Data governance can help with that. Also, achieving compliance guidelines is also important for data governance. Security for internal and external data. That's another great reason why data governance is important. And then clear and transparent communication through standardization. And this is really a prereq for when we talk about enterprise-wide data-centric initiatives. Standardization is key when we're talking about using data through an enterprise-wide, could be like a data warehouse project, could be anything around machine learning or AI or modernization, really anything that has to do with data. We need clear and transparent communication through standardization. And further specific benefits result from the specific nature of each data governance program. And so more than ever, data governance is vital for companies and organizations to remain responsive. And it's also important to open up new and innovative fields of business. For example, if you're working in an organization that is looking to dive into big data analysis or any type of AI or machine learning initiative, being successful in those new and innovative kinds of areas really do not permit the persistence of backwards thinking and overhauled structures. And so data governance is extremely important. Okay, so that's kind of the high level around what is data governance and why is data governance needed. But let's talk about why is data governance needed specifically with Power BI. And so we're going to focus this a little more here on Power BI. So hopefully I've made a case here for, why is data governance needed from a high level. But when it comes to Power BI, data governance helps us plan for self-service BI success. And I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that many of you are working with Power BI today. You might be working with it personally, just trying to learn and grow as a professional, or you might be working with it in your organization. But one of the most challenging aspects of Power BI is the proliferation of unsupported BI applications. And so Power BI is a very, very powerful tool. You can do a lot of things with it. You can, without a lot of technical knowledge, you can get out there and connect the data and model it and clean it up and do some incredible things with visualizations and all of those kinds of things. But if you don't think about data governance, before long, you're going to have this really uncontrolled proliferation of Power BI assets. And so we don't want that, right? We want to have a handle on where our data is at and who's using it, right? Data governance also helps us ensure that our data is secure but accessible, right? We want people to get the data that they need, but we don't want the wrong people to get that data. So we need to ensure that our data is secure and being distributed in a meaningful way and to the correct users. And data governance also is important for implementing processes for things like auditing, data classification, and just overall data governance. The second reason why data governance is needed has to do with just the proper governance processes for things like increasing user adoption. I'll say that most of the customers that I have and the folks that I've worked with that do the best with a Power BI implementation are the ones that plan for data governance and Power BI adoption, right? If you put together a strategy for Power BI governance and Power BI adoption, typically those projects go the best. If governance and adoption are afterthoughts, just based on my kind of anecdotal experience, what I see is that customers where governance and adoption is an afterthought struggle the most with Power BI implementations at an enterprise level. Proper governance processes also drive infrastructure and technology decisions, as well as reduce risks, since both the business and IT are typically involved in data governance, because it's all about communication. All right. Now, when we're thinking about data governance, there's some important considerations to think about, okay? We need to think about securing data uploaded to the service. We have to think about publishing data to the entire organization, how that's going to work. We also need to think about, are we going to be sharing content to external users? If you work within a regulated industry, like I work in education, and so I work with a lot of schools, and there's some level of transparency expected with school districts and universities for the success of those organizations. And so if you have requirements around sharing data externally, could even be potentially public. You have to think about, well, how is that going to work? Are we going to be publishing data sets to users or customers that are available over the internet and could be available over the internet for anyone to access? We also need to think about how are we going to share data with partners or other third parties. And then auditing report usage metrics and the audit logs are also important considerations. And the reason I bring all of this up is that if you don't decide these things up front, someone else will decide it for you. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but the question I've asked customers is, have you ever ended up in a situation with your BI report or your BI environment? Doesn't necessarily have to be Power BI or somewhere else, where you didn't define the rules and the processes up front that were going to deal with things like data security, data sharing, data auditing, all of those kinds of things, and somebody made those decisions for you, and it made a lot of work and a lot of heartbreak later on down the road. These are things that you needed to think about up front. Otherwise, somebody is going to define how security and sharing and publishing and auditing are going to work for you, just by virtue of the fact that they're building these things in Power BI. And so really the moral of the story here is, if you don't decide these things up front, someone else is going to decide them for you. Now, the kind of delivery approach that you are using for Power BI is going to dictate some of the way that data governance is going to work in Power BI. And so when we talk about different delivery approaches, you guys may have seen similar slides to this in the past. There's kind of three different delivery approaches at the highest level, right? And there's nuances to this as well. You've got business-led self-service BI. I work with a lot of organizations where a BI initiative it gets started by the business users or the end users. Then you've got IT managed self-service BI, which is sort of a blended approach. And then you've got corporate BI. Now, regardless of whatever your approach is, data governance is something that you should be thinking about for all the reasons that we already talked about. But when we talk about a business-led self-service BI initiative, this is a bottom-up approach. And so we're talking about where end users or business users are basically building their own Power BI solution, right? They don't have anybody from IT involved. They're doing all the data preparation. They're doing all the data modeling. They're creating reports. They're making sure they get refreshed. And they're figuring out all of this out on their own. They might have some people on the team who are kind of tech savvy, and maybe you have done work with things like Excel or Power Pivot, and so they have some knowledge of how these things work in Power BI. But this is a bottom-up type approach. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got corporate BI, which is kind of a top-down approach, where IT is supporting all the elements of the solution, and they handle all the things that we just talked about, all the data preparation, the data modeling, report creation, the execution, all of those things, right? And both of these approaches have challenges, and there's a number of reasons why they have challenges, right? If we're talking about business-led self-service BI, this can often be challenging because eventually at some point the business is going to encounter a challenge or a requirement or a problem that they need somebody with some real technical skills to deliver, right? And then at the other end of the spectrum, a pure corporate BI approach can often be challenging because IT can be a bottleneck for innovation and report delivery. How many times have you worked in an organization where you needed access to data, or you needed a new report, or you needed a report change where somebody needed to add a filter or a chart, and then you had to wait weeks or months or even sometimes longer for IT to get around to implementing that change? And so oftentimes we see customers move to more of a blended approach, a managed approach, where you have IT building out things like data models and ETL and standardizing how we're bringing data into Power BI, while the business is often taking a role of creating the reports and the dashboards. And so you have this blended approach. Now, there are some elements that we recommend tracking in Power BI governance programs. And at the high level, there's kind of 4 buckets here. You've got system usage, security, report performance, and data source usage. When we talk about system usage, what we're talking about is user access frequency, things like, what are the most popular data sets, the models, reports. This can also include auditing of different types of actions within Power BI. It could be who's publishing reports, who's creating workspaces, who's giving access to data sets. Can include things like also identification of support needs. What are my most critical reports? Are there potential ownership transfer opportunities? Does IT need to take ownership of a data model because it's become so critical for the business? Does IT need to take that over, right? So that's one part of system usage, right? And then when we talk about security, we're talking about report sharing activities and row-level security defined in the Power BI service, as well as ownership of data sets, data marts, reports, and dashboards. I had to update the slide and add the data marts. Did you guys see the new announcement? I'm sure you did. If you guys are paying attention to anything, the new announcement for the Power BI data marts that came out of Build last week. Have you guys checked that out yet? Had to update the slide and put it in here. The data mart stuff is super cool, but that's another element of data governance that we've got to think about, right? And we've also got to think about, well, how are we going to handle sharing? There's kind of 3 main approaches when we're talking about sharing with others, right? Are we going to share read-only dashboards from a workspace? Are we going to share, include a colleague as a member or a contributor to our workspace? Or are we going to include a colleague as a recipient of like a published app, right? So there's some things around security and sharing that we also have to think about. In report performance is really a critical, kind of a critical feature to the whole data governance landscape. And it's critical because report performance directly impacts end user adoption, right? If report consumers are struggling with report performance, meaning that they open a report and it takes a long time for the queries to run, that will be a barrier to adoption. And so we want to make sure that we have the most optimal report performance possible. And in many cases, you can have a well-designed and accurate report that is so slow that the end users have this perception that the value of the report is not critical. I've worked on projects before where customers are struggling with Power BI adoption, and the reports look great. They look great. They just take so long to refresh that the users don't like to use them. And so that's really a critical part for system governance, right? When we think about, well, how are the models performing? How frequently can we refresh them? Do they get refreshed on time? Is our capacity scaling? All of those kinds of things are things that we think about with report performance. And the last element to think about with data governance in a Power BI governance program is the data source usage. And this includes data sources that are utilized, the data refresh operations, data model sizes, as well as things like calculations. And it's important because all of this information can be used to identify potential flaws in data integrity or even overlaps in effort. And it's also important to monitor the growths of things like models, which have data imported, especially if you're working within restricted Power BI environments. If you're not on a Power BI premium capacity and you have lower data model capacities, or you're on a small Power BI premium capacity, data source usage is an important part of how we govern in the Power BI system. Now, when we talk about Power BI data governance, what are the specific elements that we govern within Power BI? And this is not a comprehensive list of things to govern, but I tried to put in the basic things in here for maybe folks that are new or not as experienced with Power BI, because I want to put some kind of concrete blockers around what are the actual technical things in Power BI that need to be governed. And when we talk about governing Power BI assets, we're talking about data sources that are published into Power BI. We're talking about the data marts, the data flows, and the data models. Now, along with all of that, one of the things that's not listed here is also the gateways, right? So if we're pulling data from data sources that are outside of Azure, or maybe even within Azure, we might have gateways that are in place, right? And gateways are those connectors between Power BI and data sources that are behind a firewall. And so gateways, of course, need to be governed. So who is going to be the admin of the gateway, and what data sources are in what gateway, and which users have admin capabilities on a gateway, and who has permissions to create content that can use data source connections within a gateway. Those are also all things that have to be governed. Then you've got governance at the tenant level, right? Who's going to determine, how do we determine what settings are set at that tenant settings level, as well as who's creating workspaces and who's adminning what workspaces, right? Also important part of what we're governing here. Then if you're going the enterprise route with Power BI, you might be running Power BI Premium or Power BI embedded capacities, depending on your use cases and what your organization is doing with Power BI. Those are also things that have to be governed. When we get into the Power BI embedded world, that's a little bit of a different animal, because now we're talking about governing Azure resources, and so I don't spend too much time talking about it in here, but I did want to include it in here in case that's something that you guys are maybe running into. How many of you here are running Power BI Premium or embedded in your place of business? Maybe just use the Teams reaction and give a thumbs up if you've got dedicated capacity with Power BI Premium or Power BI embedded. Okay, see a couple of thumbs up. Yeah. Vidor said PPU, so Power BI Premium per user. That's cool. Very cool. But those are all things that adds another wrinkle, right? The Power BI service changes so much that this data governance thing is a continuing struggle with Power BI, just because they're adding so many features and capabilities so quickly. But if you're running Power BI Premium embedded, those are some additional considerations for data governance, because those premium capacities can be governed by users that may not be the Power BI tenant admin. You might have an Office 365 admin that manages your M365 environment. You might have a Power BI admin that manages Power BI at the tenant level, and you can have additional admins that manage those individual capacities. Vidor had a question. He said, "What about governing Power BI API calls?" I mean, that's certainly another factor to this too, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit at a high level. The kinds of people that would be maybe responsible for governing Power BI API calls. I don't talk too much about the hows of doing that in this particular slide deck, but we'll talk about some of the roles and responsibilities here in a few minutes. And then the last item here, as far as what do we govern, is going to be the security standards for accessing data sources and business information in Power BI reports. So at the high level, those are kind of the items that we govern. Now, just to give you a preview of what's going to come up here, the next question I want to answer here is how do we govern? And this has to do with the roles and responsibilities that you might see within your organization for governing Power BI. Now, the slides that I have here, the roles that I've outlined here, are going to take a variety of different forms depending on the organization. So you may have one person holding multiple roles in an organization. You might have 2 or 3 people or a group of people having the same role. And an example I could give you is, right, you might have an individual that is also your Power BI architect, your Power BI developer, all at the same time, right? So they do architecting and they do developing of solutions, maybe data engineering as well. But in another organization, you might have 3 or 4 people that are Power BI developers, depending on the size of the organization. And so the point of these next few slides here is to give you some things to think about how do we actually govern these resources, what are the roles of the people that are involved, and but not really maybe a recommendation of how it should look for your particular organization. Some of that is really going to depend on the size of your organization, what your team looks like, your technical skills that you have, and all of those kinds of things. So the first role to think about when we talk about Power BI data governance is the corporate sponsor. And the corporate sponsor is the person that is responsible, or it could be a team of people that are responsible for the strategic direction of the organization and ensuring things like self-service BI is enabled so that we're empowering users to make accurate decisions with data each and every day. And the role of this person really is to influence the organizational strategy around the use of Power BI. And so this kind of person has responsibilities, or this kind of team has responsibilities around assessing which tools we're going to use in our environment, the prioritization of different processes and business areas that we're going to tackle first with Power BI, like where do we start with Power BI? Well, this corporate sponsor helps you make those decisions and is going to approve projects and sign off on those projects. Power BI initiatives can often struggle when there's no clear corporate sponsor. Most of the time, you want to have a clear corporate sponsor because that's the person that is setting the direction for the initiative. If you don't have that and you have just kind of a group of users that are running off on Power BI, you're probably not going to get a ton of traction on your Power BI initiative if there's no corporate sponsor. Because the corporate sponsor is going to be the person that can bring some budget to those projects and ensure that we have the money and resources available to be successful with a Power BI initiative. Then you also need a Power BI administrator. And the Power BI administrator is the person that makes sure that the whole Power BI service is set up correctly. And they're ensuring that everything is being monitored. And so a Power BI admin is the kind of person that has a high level knowledge of IT service management and authentication. And so they typically come from they might be on like the M365 side and are used to monitoring the M365 service, or they might be a dedicated Power BI admin and have that Power BI admin role in the M365 tenant. But this person would be responsible for like your initial setup of Power BI. They'd coordinate if there's M365 or Azure teams involved, they would coordinate with those folks. They're also responsible for license assignment. So if you're doing things like buying pro licenses or Power BI premium per user licenses, they're responsible for making sure that the right people get the licenses assigned based on the direction of the project. They also might be responsible for initial setup of Power BI premium capacities, which we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. They'll also do things like typically set up some of the monitoring in the service. They'll do things like gateway management as well. So they might help set up gateways for specific maybe corporate IT data assets. So if you have things like a data warehouse or an enterprise IT data environment that you need to use to bring data into Power BI, this person might be responsible for those gateways and configuring those and ensuring that you've got high availability for your gateways and those kinds of things. So those can all be things that a Power BI administrator may be partially responsible for. Ideally, you want to have more than one person be your Power BI administrator. And the reason for that is, that person probably would like to be able to take a day off every now and then. And if you have that role or responsibility only given to one person, then that can be a struggle for your organization if that person is ever out of office, if they're busy, if you can't get a hold of them for whatever reason. Having a single Power BI administrator can be a blocker for success with Power BI. So it's good to have people cross-trained on these features and these capabilities so that you can ensure that you have more than one person that can help you with administration of Power BI. Okay. One of the things that I'll call out here is the tenant settings in the admin portal. If you work in an organization and your Power BI team has never had a sit-down conversation around every single setting in the tenant settings, then that's probably not a good thing. You probably have a recipe for disaster. Remember, we talked about earlier about if you don't think about data governance and plan for data governance up front, someone else will decide for you This is one of those things. So you want to make sure that you go through every single Power BI tenant setting in your admin console and make sure that everything is configured exactly the way that you want it. And you want to understand the implications of setting each setting one particular way. So I'll give you an example. One time I worked with a customer that had set publish to web enabled for the entire organization. And as you guys may well know, publish to web allows an individual to make a report public or available for anonymous access. Well, that's a problem if you don't want your data to be made public. They didn't really understand the implications of this setting, and they had actually used this as a workaround to avoid Power BI licensing. So they said, hey, if we do publish to web, we can have one person in IT make reports public, and then we'll just secure it by taking that publish to web link and we'll put it behind a secure SharePoint site, and that way it'll be secured. And they were really disappointed and upset to find out that that was not sufficient for securing their Power BI reports and assets. And I had to have a sit-down conversation with their CIO and say, do you understand what you're doing here? This is going to be a huge problem. If anyone with that link gets access to it, that shouldn't have access to it. Anybody outside of the organization. Just because you're wrapping that link in a SharePoint site or behind an application isn't sufficient for securing that data. And so Power BI administrator should really take the lead on making sure that all of these are configured, but likely how these settings are going to be configured are really going to depend on a committee decision, right? You need to talk to the stakeholders, you need to talk to the end users, you need to talk to folks in IT, you understand what are our security and compliance requirements, and how is that going to affect how we set every single setting here. One of the other things that I'll also show here too is that you'll see that there's an option here for embed codes. Embed codes are codes that are used to embed Power BI content in external applications. So when we talk about publish to web, these are the embed codes that are generated by publish to web. And this is a single screen where you can see exactly all of the embed codes that are created in your organization. What workspace do they live in? Who published them? And are they currently active? And so that example we were talking about earlier, where they were using publish to web as a workaround from having to license users and thinking that they were securing it correctly, I said, hey, let's go to this embed code screen here, and let's see how many embed codes that we have. And we came to the screen, and there were hundreds of embed codes. There was data being shared publicly across this organization, and they had no idea. And it was really, really bad. And so they came in here, and they were able to come in here to this screen and find out where all this content lived at, who had published it, and they had a conversation with these users who are publishing this content, and they were able to come in here and remove these embed codes to make sure that only data that should be public was being shared using publish to web with the embed codes. That's a great example of why data governance is so important with Power BI, and how you can actually perform some of those data governance tasks by monitoring things like which data is being shared publicly, who's sharing it, and should they be sharing it, and all of those kinds of things. The embed code screen gives you a great insight into exactly what's being shared publicly. Now, a role of a person that would work probably closely with the Power BI administrator would be the Power BI capacity administrators. Now, I know some of you in here said that you had Power BI Premium in your place of business, or you're using Power BI Embedded. Is anybody here on the call the capacity administrator? Are you responsible for administering your Power BI Premium capacity? So Augustin said that he is the Power BI capacity admin. And that's really cool, because this is the role that we're talking about here. And ideally, just like with the Power BI admin, you would want to have more than one person being the capacity admin, so that you have no bottlenecks. Augustin said he is also the tenant admin, so he's got his plate full. Augustin, are you the only person who is the tenant admin and the capacity admin, or do you have any members of your team that help you with that responsibility?
Fortunately, I'm not the only one.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. So that means you can take a day off.
Yeah, sometimes.
Sometimes. Well, it's good to have multiple members of that role, and in most organizations, that's what you want to have. Now, sometimes you might work for a really small organization, and you might be like the one person who is wearing all of those hats, and that can be really challenging. But the Power BI capacity admin is the person that is responsible for managing those premium capacities. They're making sure that they're optimized for the workloads. They're managing how do we use that capacity? What workloads are we going to run on the capacity? Are we going to run paginated reports on our capacity? Are we going to run AI and ML workloads on this capacity? Who can use this capacity? What workspaces are we putting on our capacity? And are we monitoring our premium capacity? Those are all the things that Augustin is thinking about, right? When he's managing that Power BI premium capacity. Those are all decisions that he and the team have to make when managing their capacity. Typically, this person has a high level knowledge of analysis services resource management, although I won't say that's probably a requirement. I don't know very many Power BI admins that have knowledge of analysis services resource management. So I wouldn't say that would be a requirement, but that can be a helpful skill to have if you come from a background that has a knowledge of how to use analysis services. Also, Power BI service management is important. So if you don't have Power BI service management experience or much knowledge of that, then the capacity admin might work very closely with the Power BI admin to make sure that things are being set up and configured in the right way. Sometimes I also see the Power BI capacity admin being a business user. That this person can also be a business user depending on the way that your organization is structured. So you may have business units that have their own premium capacity, and they have members of their team that manage that capacity. And that person will probably need to work very closely with IT if they don't have the necessary technical skill set to make sure that their capacity is being set up and configured correctly. And so the Power BI capacity admin does things like sets up the premium capacity. They're going to coordinate with the Power BI admin, any Azure teams that they're working with. They're going to handle things like workspace assignment and management. They're going to certainly set up the monitoring. This is also a person that's going to decide, should we be running on Gen 1 or Gen 2? Now that Power BI Premium Gen 2 is now available, hopefully you've already made that migration, but the manual or the automatic cutover to Premium Gen 2 is coming up. I don't remember what the date is off the top of my head. So if you're running Power BI Premium today and it's Gen 1, you should really have a conversation with your Power BI admin and your capacity admin to say, hey, when are we going to make this switch over to Gen 2? Because this is going to be an automatic thing coming up. Now, if you're unfamiliar, there is a Power BI Premium Capacity Admin screen that you get access to when you become a capacity admin. You don't necessarily have to be an M365 admin, but you can get access to the capacity settings without being a Power BI or an M365 admin. And you may see multiple capacities depending on how many capacities you have. You might have them all listed here. You might have a few different capacities, and you can see the capacities, who are the admins, the type of SKU that you're using for those capacities, the size of the SKU, and where it's located if you're doing things with like multi-geo or any of those kinds of things. And within those capacities, you can define who is the admin. You can define who can assign workspaces to that capacity, and then you also have the workload options, which I'll show here on the next screen. Let's see. Ian Pike said, next 3 months, I think all Gen 1, Gen 2 are migrated by, but you should have a message in your tenant already. Yeah, that's right, Ian. Thanks for calling that out. If you're the Power BI admin or the M365 admin, you probably have already seen that message in your tenant. And so hopefully you're already aware of that. Yeah, good call out, Ian. Thank you. These are the Power BI premium capacity settings that the premium capacity admin would typically be responsible for. Things like, how are we going to allow AI workloads? Are we going to allow things like automated ML to be run in our capacity? Are we going to allow things like open XMLA endpoints. I think this screenshot here is a little dated because now this is a little bit of a different experience now. But are we going to allow data flows to run on here? What memory? How much memory are we going to make available to data flows? Are we going to allow paginated reports? All those kinds of things are things that you set at the capacity level. And that's also probably part of a wider governance conversation that you have with your Power BI admin and your business users who are going to be using this capacity. What are the kinds of workloads that you're going to allow in this capacity and in this environment? One of the things that's a really big one that I'll call out here is XMLA endpoints. If you're going to allow connectivity to your Power BI workspaces that are sitting on premium capacity, enabling this XMLA endpoint will allow users to connect third-party tools to Power BI. Things like could be Tableau, could be SQL Server Management Studio, could be all kinds of things. Could be oh man, I'm forgetting it now. What's the SQL BI's tool? Augustin, help me out here. I just blanked on it.
Which one? DAX Studio.
Yeah. DAX Studio, right? If you're going to use tools like DAX Studio or any other kind of tabular model development tools or performance tuning tools, right? Yeah, SSMS, all of those things can be connected to Power BI when you open that XMLA endpoint. Now, whether you should open that XMLA endpoint is a deeper discussion to have, but it's a really powerful capability that Power BI has. Whether you open this up or not is definitely should be a decision that you don't make lightly, and you don't just come in here and say, hey, yeah, we're going to flip this switch and allow XMLA endpoints to be open. That's part of a deeper data governance conversation that you should have, and about, do we have a use case that requires this, and should we be doing this, and who's going to have capability to do these kinds of things. Definitely something to think about. The Power BI Premium Capacity Admin is also going to be responsible for capacity monitoring and ensuring that capacity is being used effectively. One of the things that I haven't called out yet is somebody who is a capacity admin may also help with performance tuning. And so if you have workloads that are performing poorly, or you're struggling with, or you need help with, the capacity admin may be the person to help you with that, especially if they have access to your premium capacity usage and metrics reporting. Now, there's a new set of reports that are open or that are available for Power BI Premium Gen 2 that you use with Gen 2. So be aware of that if you're making that switch over from Power BI Premium Gen 1 to Gen 2. There's a whole new set of reporting metrics that will give you information around how resources are being used in your capacity, which ones are taking up the most space, how long queries are taking to run, how long do refreshes take to run, is the performance good? All of those kinds of things are things that are available here on this report. And so somebody like an architect or a developer who is working on a Power BI performance issue may work with a capacity admin to get access to this content, so that way that they can do performance tuning and figure out what's going on and maybe why something's not performing too well. A data information security manager is also an important part of this important role to think about when we're talking about Power BI governance. Data policy enforcement is really all about making sure that data is used in accordance with whatever your internal or external compliance regulations and guidelines are. And so this person really is just making sure that we're following all the security compliance policies and that the data is always stored securely, but is accessible to only the right people for this. This person is probably not working in Power BI every single day. This person is probably working as part of a team in any new BI or Power BI projects. And so they've got knowledge around, IT service management, auditing, security, those kinds of skill sets. And they would typically be responsible for things like, where's the data going to live? Are we going to use direct query? Are we going to import the data into Power BI? Does it make sense to bring it into Azure? They're probably going to be responsible for things like auditing to see who is using what data sets. And they're also going to be responsible for things like data policy enforcement. They might also be responsible for things like which users or security groups have access to Power BI data gateways, who has permissions to use data gateways to bring data into Power BI. This person would also have be a decision maker on that particular topic. And so, like I said, this person's probably not in Power BI every single day, but they would probably use things like maybe the audit log to search for different types of activities to do reporting on who's doing what, right? Who is publishing reports? Is anybody publishing reports to the web? Are they editing reports or deleting groups? Who's creating workspaces? Just to have a handle on who's doing what specifically with Power BI. They might also do things like configure the data classifications. Whatever classifications your organization is using, things like high business impact, if there are data sets that are high business impact, low business impact, if there are data sets that should be public, are there data sets that are confidential? The Power BI security admin would have some influence over the types of data classifications that you use for your Power BI assets, and ensuring that the right sensitivity levels are set for any data sets or reports or dashboards that are within your Power BI environment. One of the things that I'll point out here is these labels here provide a really kind of a simple way for you to ensure that users are knowledgeable around the classification of critical content in Power BI without really compromising productivity or the ability to collaborate, right? And so this is a really helpful way for users to have a clear understanding of what kind of data am I using, who should be looking at this data, and what kind of and how does this data set have impact to the business. These sensitivity labels can be applied in Power BI Desktop by your Power BI developers, and they can also be applied in the Power BI service. And so it gives you this capability to really protect your sensitive data from the moment that you start developing Power BI Desktop, developing your content, to when it's being accessed in the Power BI service, or even when it's being accessed from Excel using a live connection. Do we have anybody here that uses the Analyze in Excel feature in Power BI, that they use Excel to connect to those live data sets and do pivot tables and pivot charts on those kinds of things? Or do you have users in your organization that actually connect to Power BI with Excel? I don't see it that feature used a ton, but I'm just curious if we've got anybody here that's doing that. Data steward is another important role, and this is the person that is responsible for creating and maintaining business metadata. The rules around metadata, they do things like assess and enhance data quality, and they share and collaborate across business and technical stakeholders. So the data steward might have skills around data modeling for things like mashups in ETL and provisioning data models in Power BI. And they also might create and maintain business metadata for the purpose of enhancing data quality. This person will likely have some interest in tools like Microsoft Purview. And so Purview has some really tight integration capabilities with Power BI that really enable a lot of these data governance scenarios that we're talking about. Things like understanding impact analysis and lineage of how data moves through Power BI and your ecosystem, how data is classified, how that data is being used, and how sensitive data is distributed across your environment. That's where we kind of start to get into some of the capabilities of what Microsoft Purview can do, which I think I've got a couple of things in here related to that. But Data Steward is also interested in things like data profiling and understanding the cleanliness of data. And so here I just included a screenshot of some of the profiling capabilities that you have within Power BI Desktop to see things like, do we have any errors? Do we have empty values? What's the average distribution? And this is somebody who might work with somebody on the data engineering side, on the development side, to ensure that the quality of data that is being used for model development is to a certain standard. Now, just a follow-up question here. How many of you are familiar with Microsoft Purview and bonus points if you're using Microsoft Purview with Power BI today? Anybody currently using Purview with Power BI? Just give me the thumbs up if you aren't. I'm not seeing any thumbs up. All right, I guess I don't get to give out any bonus points. But Microsoft Purview is relatively new data governance tool in Azure that allows you to have that allows you to build a unified data map for enabling things like business glossary and classification and sensitivity and data cataloging all in a single platform, regardless of where your data is coming from, whether it's coming from Azure or other clouds like AWS or from your data center on-prem or even going into Power BI. And so with Purview, you can search for data assets, things like, if I'm looking for where I want to see where all the places in my data platform where customer data is stored, right? I could do a search in the data catalog for customer, and I can say, well, you know what, let's find customers, and I want to see where customer exists in the raw zone, and maybe I'm looking for specifically for email addresses, right? I could do a search in Purview to find that kind of stuff. And furthermore, it has a very nice integration with Power BI. So somebody who's a data steward might really appreciate being able to drill down on specific Power BI workspaces like campaign analytics and see how many data sets are in that workspace, what reports are in that workspace using those data sets, and then which reports are being used to feed dashboards. I could go back and also see things like lineage of where that data comes from, maybe Synapse. Is there some data transformation being done with a Synapse ingestion pipeline? And then what data sources are those pipelines reading from? And so Purview gives you this really awesome capability to do impact analysis and understand the lineage of your data in a single place. And so I think somebody like a data steward is probably going to spend a lot of time working in Power BI, understanding the quality of the data, but also doing using the catalog in something like Purview to understand and explore where data comes from, how it gets cleaned, and then where does it go in Power BI, for the purpose of understanding, are we actually using the right data to make decisions? You've also got the data architect role, and this person is responsible for the technical architecture aligned to the business requirements. And so this person is probably a very technical person. They've got knowledge of on-prem and cloud data technologies, and they have experience with them. And so their job is to take the business requirements and match it with the technical capabilities. And they're going to work with the capacity admin. They're going to work with the Power BI administrator. They're going to work with the stakeholder. They're going to work with the business user to make sure that that person, he or she, is designing a solution that uses the right technology to meet the right requirement. And this person will also be responsible for designing an architecture that meets the security and governance standards of your organization. So they're going to work with a security person to make sure that they're developing an architecture that meets this, not just the business requirements, but also the security requirements. BI developer could also maybe wear a hat, or an architect could also wear a hat as a developer as well. But this is the person that is actually developing the BI solution, right? They're building in Power BI. So they have a full understanding of the capabilities of the Microsoft BI platform, and they're staying up to date on those things. So they're working in Power BI Desktop to build models and reports. They're enhancing existing solutions in the Power BI service. They're releasing new content to be tested and pushed into production. And they're making new data sources available to self-service. So this person is doing a lot of work across the entire stack to develop and enhance new and existing solutions. One of the things I wanted to call out here was the Power BI champion. And this is kind of a unique role, but this is a person that really helps drive the adoption for self-service BI. And a Power BI champion may be outside of IT and maybe within the realm of the business group, because this is a person who is maybe not a member of IT or a technical expert, but is a subject matter expert. They've got skills around Excel and self-service BI, and they have a high-level understanding of the Power BI capabilities. A Power BI champion is a great role to have in your organization because it helps scale the development and innovation around Power BI. They can help evangelize the vision for the company. They can collaborate with other users and corporate sponsors to make sure that we're strategically deploying Power BI across the organization. And they also have some knowledge of the governance and governance standards and policies within your organization. And so this is a person that really is driving innovation and helping your users tackle Power BI questions without making IT the bottleneck for that. And so I really like when organizations have a person that is like a champion or an evangelist for Power BI, because it really helps drive adoption and ensure success of any self-service projects. And one of the things that I put in my slide deck was like a picture of the data marts capability in Power BI, because a champion would be the kind of person that would be paying attention to the announcements that are coming out of build. They're paying attention to what's in the Power BI monthly updates. So that way they can take that information, bring it back to the business, bring it back to IT and say, hey, we've got these new capabilities. Let's make sure that we're fully utilizing these new capabilities so that we can be successful in our implementation of Power BI. Last two roles that I'll cover here, the business as usual or the BAU support specialist is just the person that is making sure that Power BI is running smoothly. They're making sure that they're monitoring and issuing any problems or issues that pop up. They might do some minor enhancement, but they're not doing heavy Power BI development. They're mostly making sure that everything is running as it should in the Power BI service. So if there's any weird issues that pop up with performance or refreshes, or a data set didn't refresh on time, or a report is broken or something like this, the BAU specialist might be the person who will be looking into that to address it as quickly as possible. Then kind of at the other end of that support spectrum is that you've got the business support specialist, and this person is helping business users in developing the Power BI solutions. So they've got knowledge of your company's data governance standards. They're working with the business as usual support specialist. They might be working with the developers around complex modeling scenarios. Maybe they're creating reusable Power BI templates. Maybe they're creating theme templates, but they're supporting the business in the use of Power BI. So in summary here, these are really kind of the main things I wanted to cover here. And I hope that, I know that was a lot of information to digest. I hope that was useful to kind of give you a high level understanding about, what is data governance, why it's important, and what are we governing and how do we govern. Governance can really help you plan for success in your organization when rolling out Power BI or Power BI solutions. And having a close relationship between the business and the IT sides, and having those folks on both sides involved will help you reduce risks. And most importantly, I think when we're talking about rolling out Power BI, having proper governance in place will help increase adoption. Now, I know that this is a very large topic, and I know that we've covered a lot here, but there's still so much more that we could talk about. I'll just show that in the resources section of this slide, I've put a lot of links to documentation, like the Power BI Enterprise Deployment White Paper, the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. These links right here are gold. So if you're running Power BI in your organization and you're not familiar with these resources, you need to look at these right away. If you're planning to roll out Power BI in the future, definitely come look at this content here. I've also got some other links to here, things to the Microsoft Purview documentation and how Purview works with Power BI. I think that's also really, really important. So try to include all of that in here. I hope that this was helpful. But I'll go ahead and stop it right here and say thanks for having me, Augustin, and letting me present. I hope that you guys found that content helpful, and I'll just open it up to any questions anybody on the team has.
Yeah, this was a great presentation. Thank you, Dustin. So each time, as I said in the beginning, each time I'm listening to a governance presentation, something new pops up or something you heard sometime but just forgot. So it was really helpful, I think. Joel has a question in the chat.
Yeah, Joel, that's a great question. So Joel's question was, he said, you emphasized earlier the combination of governance and adoption, and thinking of the adoption roadmap, why is that combo so critical to implementing Power BI? Yeah, that's a really good question, Joel. And so we talked about governance, why governance is important, right? Because if you don't think about those decisions up front around how we govern Power BI, somebody else is going to make that decision for you. And that's how you end up in the scenario of people doing things with data or using data in an improper way. So we don't want that to happen, right? Adoption is so important because we can build this great BI solution in Power BI, and Power BI is super powerful. It can do amazing things. But if we don't have adoption of that solution and no one uses it, then who cares that we have really fast performance on refreshes. We've got really great queries, and we've got amazing charts, and we're doing incredible things with visualization. Having the successful adoption of that is really critical. Otherwise, I mean, if no one's adopted it, then the project's a failure, right? Because then we have no one using Power BI. So it's that combination of governance and adoption that is so critical to the success of a Power BI implementation. Does that make sense, Joel? Does that answer your question?
Feel free to unmute whoever wants to start a question, or just type it in the chat, whatever makes you feel more comfortable. One question from my side, Dustin, from the roles you are presenting now, from your point of view, what's the most critical one?
Oh man, what's the most critical? Man, that's a tough one. So I think to be successful with Power BI, you got to have a corporate sponsor, right? Somebody that is going to kind of set the vision and the strategy, right, for rolling out Power BI. So that I think that is extremely critical. If you don't have that, then the initiative can only go so far if you don't have corporate backing behind the initiative. And I'm just thinking of, of course, I'm coming at this from like a Microsoft seller of data products and services and things. And so I'm thinking about my projects that do the well are the ones that have some sort of executive sponsors, executive backing. So I think that is certainly important. But the executive can't do the work, right? They're not the technical person, right? They're just setting the strategy and the vision. So you also need to have somebody on you need to have a tight collaboration with the M365 and Power BI admins. You need an architect and you need a developer, right? And I think all of those kind of roles are the most important. The folks that are on like the support side and the data steward side, those are probably roles that can be filled with people that are also acting as Power BI admin or developers, because you're going to have a lot of crossover from skill sets. But I think probably if I had to pick like maybe top 4, it'd be like that. You got to have that sponsor, you got to have the admins, and you got to have architects and developers.
Yeah, sounds perfect. Is there any other question? I'm looking at the chat, so I don't see it for now. If you have it, feel free. I'll just put in the slide for next week, but you can still feel free to pop up with questions if there are no questions. So I want to thank you, Dustin, for a great and informative presentation. So it was really a pleasure hearing it. And another question from Victor.
Yeah, let's see. Vidor says, excellent session, Dustin. Question, do you have some tips for setting up governance standards and policies in a collaborative way? Yeah, that's a great question. One of the resources that is in the slide deck, which I'll share with Augustin after this, what's the best way to share that, Augustin? Should I send it to you or should I just put it in the Teams chat?
You can send it to me anyhow. I will post the recording next week to our YouTube channel, and I can put there as well a link to presentation. Okay.
All right, great. I'll send you the slides. But Vidor, one of the resources in my slide deck is the planning a Power BI enterprise deployment, and then the other resource is that adoption roadmap that talks a lot about how do you set up governance standards and policies in Power BI. Some of that is more of like just a data governance in general conversation, but the adoption roadmap and the enterprise deployment white paper will talk about that with specifics to Power BI. So make sure you take a look at the resources.
I'm really glad that Power BI governance is catching up. Looking, I don't know, 2 years back, nobody was talking about governance, security, and everything.
Yeah.
And simply, I think companies are missing that part at the moment. So it's really a hot topic.
Yeah, unfortunately, data governance usually comes up when there's a problem, not proactively. And I think most of the data governance conversations that I'm having right now with customers are customers that have issues with data being used incorrectly.
And that's true. So for everybody, feel free to join and look at the upcoming sessions on our meetup channel. As you see on top of the slide, so next week, Wednesday, same time, Andy Cutler is with us, digging a bit into Synapse and the integration with Power BI. So it will be another really interesting session. This session from Dustin will post probably beginning of next week to our YouTube channel together with all the materials. So feel free to check it out, subscribe, you'll get notification when it's there. And once again, Dustin, it was great to have you. Thanks for your time and for contribution to broader Power BI community.
Yeah, thank you, Augustin. Thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Everybody, thank you for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
See you. Bye.